Good morning, everyone. So Henry James here, Wales and West Utilities, industrial cluster lead, but also covering some transport projects as well. And yeah, I'd be really thrilled to be involved in this discovery phase project. We deliver the project alongside Guidehouse, also RWE's technology provider, National Grid Electricity Distribution, and Pembrokeshire County Council. And I've got Tushar Biani on the call today, who's going to support in delivering some of the slides. Next slide, please. So in terms of agenda, we'll first run through background and problem statement, then go to project outputs, so what we've learned from the project, and then next steps later on. Next 2 slides forward, please. Brilliant. So what is the problem? So essentially, we know that heat and transport are both inherently difficult sectors to decarbonise, both have their own challenges, and both have their own innovations that are taking place individually as separate entities. But what we want to look at in this project is how we could decarbonise both of those sectors and both of those energy streams in one project. And by doing that, we can hopefully lower the levelized cost of hydrogen through assessing that in a whole systems manner. Some of the issues with this is that heat produced during electrolysis is theoretically high enough, so actually an opportunity to support the decarbonisation of district heating, whereas otherwise typically wasted. So integrating essentially hydrogen production through electrolysis, using that waste heat in heat networks or for other sources of waste heat demand. This is then in anticipation of growing hydrogen transport demand and addresses both the need in an uncoordinated manner, could essentially waste investment, so could lead to inefficient investment in network infrastructure because heat and transport are being dealt with separately. So the solution that we came up with was hence the integrated hydrogen transport hubs concept, is that by taking an integrated approach to decarbonise heat and transport, that then provides an opportunity to improve network usage and ultimately lower system costs for the user and for the customer. What we want to do then is explore how co-locating electrolyzers at sites where both there is a need for heat and hydrogen and district heating, and specifically where hydrogen is being used to refuel heavy goods vehicles and buses. The innovations behind this and what we've looked at in discovery is essentially utilizing excess heat and oxygen as not a business as usual case in these systems. Usually these are wasted revenue streams, and usually usually hydrogen is the principal source of revenue. So actually using excess heat and oxygen is what we looked at. And also assessing then the value of electrolyzed excess heat and oxygen hasn't been quantified at an industrial scale either. So it's been more of a small scale undertaking. Lastly, then, there are very few projects that have actually done this, and only a couple across Europe which have used waste heat but not oxygen at the same time. So how do we revenue stack those opportunities, both heat and oxygen, and use that to lower the levelized cost of hydrogen? A couple of changes that we've had through the discovery phase. So electricity curtailment became quite an issue for us in terms of understanding how we would factor that into the analysis, and also because of the limited data that we could get hold of. So it became quite a challenge to actually assess that in the whole systems archetype that we looked at, which we'll discuss shortly. So that's been moved forward into alpha, purely because of the limitation of data, but also the challenges of actually modeling that. Second then is oxygen utilization was put down as secondary importance, and that's because the value of that oxygen is highly dependent on what off-takers are essentially willing to pay for it. So you have different values, whether that's industrial oxygen or higher grade oxygen uses, such as in medicine and by hospitals. We go forward 2 slides, please. So how do we deliver the project? So we delivered it in five separate phases. The first phase was to define the archetype of concept. So what actually we were looking at, what's the high level battery limits of the system, and what would that look like when we start putting figures and plugging figures into it. That was defining the optimal configuration of the system, essentially taking all revenue streams into consideration and selecting the optimal electrolyzer capacity, electrical capacity, based on transport heating demand, as well as economic viability as well. So particularly with the view on beta and how we'd actually go and deploy that. We're not going to look at something which is perhaps 20 megawatts because that's going to be unfeasible at this stage. We want something which is realistic and deployable. Second then was identifying suitable hub locations, and the main part of that exercise was to determine the criteria for identifying those hub locations and weighting assigned to each of the criteria. So some of the criteria we looked at was clearly heat demand based on existing but also developing domestic heat networks, but also transport demand as well. So potential demand from HGVs and buses, and mapping that alongside critical road infrastructure as well. So mainly looking at motorways, intersections, and areas like that. We identified 8 suitable hub locations across Wales and West through that decision matrix. Part 3 then was in stakeholder engagement. So we engaged with hydrogen hub and district heat network developers, and the aim of that was really to refine the archetype of concepts of what we'll show on the next slide, and make sure that was aligned with developers and what they'd ideally look to see if you were to go through into deployment. Fourth section was looking at the regulatory policy and funding landscape. So how would we actually fund this sort of system, and also what the policy barriers which may stop us from doing that. And part of that is identifying suitable funding mechanisms applicable to the hub. That's quite challenging given the different revenue streams and the fact it takes in obviously there's one input and there's multiple outputs. So there's different ways in which those can be funded. And lastly then was developing the business case, so bringing all that information together and identifying the 3 cost streams or 4 benefit streams for an integrated solution, but also quantifying net benefits of deploying the hubs right out to 2070. So how we're going to meet net zero in 2050, but also the longer term benefits for the 20 years that follow, estimated reduction in the cost of hydrogen, and determining the impact of gas price and carbon price sensitivities. Next slide, please. So what do we learn from the project? So the first thing is that the most optimal solution is essentially where excess heat is fully utilized. It can be quite valuable if deployed in the right way. And actually with the technology that we were looking at and the archetype of concept, we selected a solution where in terms of alkaline electrolysis, which is preferred technology, and that's because of the high operating temperatures which that electrolysis process operates at, and therefore the waste heat which is available. Excuse me. And by selecting that technology, it's not only providing the necessary heat that can be utilized, so high temperature and high value heat. It's also quite deployable, as we know alkaline is perhaps the more advanced electrolysis technology which is available on the market. We also looked at modularity and design, multiple off-taker users. So actually, what are the key elements of this that you need to identify in order to move through into the next stage? So identifying those key elements, and that actually fed through into sort of additional partner requirements that we've identified for Alpha as well. So looking at that whole value chain of what the hub could look like, and those critical elements was really key in identifying where the barriers might be and where some of the challenges were. And what we settled on was a 3 megawatt electrolyzer capacity is actually potentially the most feasible in terms of deploying a system through beta and deploying that across the network. And that 3 megawatt system just at a high level equates to around 800 to 1,000 houses in terms of district heating, which for us, I think when we started looking at the deployability of these and also the approximate size of district heating networks out there, both in development, also both developed and deployed, but also in development and in planning, that seemed like a very good fit for us in terms of marrying up that waste heat requirement with transport. And I think that 3 megawatt size is also quite applicable to sort of when you start looking at some of the local councils' needs for bus refuelling and heavy goods vehicles. That's the sort of magnitude at which those parties are looking at in terms of transport as well. So it felt like a really good fit, and obviously based on the criteria came out as a preferred option. In terms of locations then, you can see on the bottom right there that the heat map that shows heat demand and heat supply across our region, and also on the right there where transport hotspots and heat networks have also mapped onto there. And it's quite clear to see that Bristol south, so we split Bristol up into sort of south and north of the M5, and that south location where the city centre is actually a really attractive option due to the number of district heating networks which are already present, but also some that we're aware of being in development as well. Sorry, could we? Yeah, thanks. Great. That's fine. I'll pass over to Tushar now, who's going to cover this slide. Thanks.
No, thanks, Henry, and morning all. So as Henry's mentioned, I think one of the key work streams that we looked at was really engaging with district heat and hydrogen hub developers. And that was really to understand and gain technical expertise on potentially existing projects that have been implemented or are being in the design process, as well as looking and understanding what the commercial aspect would look like for the project. So what we've done on the slide is really broken up the key findings in heat networks on the left and then hydrogen hub on the right. From a district heat perspective, I think the stakeholder engagers really helped provide clarity and insight in terms of how the overall system looks like, in terms of how you're able to capture heat, which will be through the main heat exchanger, then the energy center, which would have your backup boilers, and then the actual distribution network to residential or communal properties. It also really helps to identify what would be the demarcation point and the battery limit. So again, really understanding how the concept is going to be structured potentially, and then who will have the ownership and responsibility as we look forward in Alpha in terms of developing that. One of the other key aspects that district heat network developers helped identify and confirm is that the heat that is produced from electrolyzers can be utilized. So the UK is currently now implementing fourth generation district heat systems, and these are now operating at lower temperature. So it shows that the operating range for electrolyzers really fits in with the new district heat networks that are being deployed, and thus really providing technical viability. And really, I think one of the other key pieces of information that we were able to identify is understanding what the commercial pricing would be for using excess heat. Typically in district heat networks, these are benchmarks against the natural gas supply and then discounted to thus be providing a sort of competitive rate, essentially. And that was really valuable information that we could take into our business case. We did the same exercise for the hydrogen hub as well, and really looked at speaking to various stakeholders. One in particular was Statkraft, who were deploying a project in the Pembrokeshire area in southwest or South Wales. They again really provided us with a detailed understanding of the concept that they are deploying, which was really regarding central production station for hydrogen, and then having these mobile refuelers that are fueled at the central site, then sent to your refueling station that could be in a 50-mile radius. And that's where you have your hydrogen transport, such as buses or HVGs being filled. And then that refueling unit going back to your main hub site to be refueled. Again, speaking with Statkraft, one additional key piece of information that we identified was really understanding the funding mechanism. Previously, the project had looked at gaining funding through the renewable fuel transport obligations, which are essentially credits that you earn for producing hydrogen development fuel that's used in transport. But because of the immaturity of the market and the criteria that are needed to meet them, the hub and the developer actually switched their commercial model to the hydrogen business model that was released, as that de-risked the project for them. So again, really valuable piece of information. And then really lastly, we looked at other sort of technical parameters, one being the storage and on-site and identifying what that would be when it be deployed. And it was identified that it should be below 5 tons, which is based on COBRA regs. Next slide, please. And I'll just hand it over back to Henry to step through this.
Thanks, Tushar. So very briefly, I'm just going to cover the barriers and opportunities for funding, but also some of the regulatory barriers that we have as well. So in terms of barriers on the left-hand side, one of the main things we identified through stakeholder engagement was essentially how the renewable transport fuel obligations, the RTFO, has highly strict requirements on additionality. So that is potentially essentially around proving where your source of electricity is coming from, and also marrying that on a time basis as well to how you're using that electricity source. And that could be really challenging for the hub concept, and also one which we're going to explore further in Alpha. But that strict requirement is potentially one which means that we'd have to look at other funding options to use for the hub. Other barriers are perhaps more obvious and practical ones, but control of major accident hazards, so COMA, which many people will be aware of, and trying to keep below the 5-ton storage limit on site to not breach into that lower tier COMA limit. Then there's also the GSMR aspects and approval required there from the HSE if blended or pure hydrogen is transported in hydrogen pipelines, which will be likely. In terms of opportunities then, so clearly there are numerous ways in which the hub could be funded. And one of the things we identified through this, so we have the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund as being one of those, Hydrogen Business Model, a Green Heat Network Fund. But particularly the hydrogen business model is that despite the fact that our criteria identified a 3 megawatt capacity as being viable for deployment, actually the hydrogen business model, as some people will be aware already, has a minimum production capacity of 5 megawatts, which means we may have to look at increasing capacity to meet the eligibility criteria of that model. And Green Heat Network Fund also had similar challenges in the sense that it's only applicable to England, so that rules out any deployment of the project in Wales using that fund. Next slide, please, and I'll hand back over to Tushar.
No, thank you. So really, I think with the piece of information in terms of understanding the Arcto concept, understanding the locations, we then really took all that information and built our business case and cost benefit analysis, which is summarized on this slide. So what we first calculated was really the cumulative benefits from the integrated hub. So these are really looking at what is the benefits associated with having the additional oxygen and excess heat stream. And this is what's been quantified on the curve. So in terms of the additional benefits that we've quantified, that the first one is the additional revenue that's generated from selling excess heat and oxygen. The other benefit is the savings on the energy bill to consumers. So through the market engagement, we were able to identify the percentage reduction that excess heat would have compared to natural gas, and taking that and applying that throughout the period. And then lastly, understanding what the CO2 savings are from applying a district heat network or supplying oxygen that's generated from green electricity, for example. What does that equate to? So in terms of that's what's been quantified on the curve itself. What we can see is that the initial sort of beta project would be implemented first and completed by 2028. We would then really roll it out as a BAU across all the various networks until 2023 or 2033. And then really that is building up the cumulative benefits and reaching various milestones that we've annotated on the graph. In terms of the overall cumulative benefit that it would generate is approximately 71 million by 2070. So really showing that there is a positive business case behind implementing and developing this solution. One additional item that we've looked at was regarding the reinforcement costs on the gas network. These are costs that could be avoided on the gas network due to new users being added on, and thus the cost required on the network to maintain the supply for that particular user. When we actually started to look into this, what we identified is that we needed a lot more granular information, really in terms of understanding where the hub is being located, so that you can understand what the overall gas network system looks at that point to then quantify the reinforcement costs that are avoided. This is something that we'll be looking into the alpha phase, but we know that this could be potentially substantial compared to some of the other net benefits that we've already quantified. Next slide, please. And the one after. And I'll just pass it over to Henry to close on the next steps.
Thanks again, Tushar. So so next steps of how we deploy and develop this concept. Obviously, we've gone through discovery now and covered the work done in that. In Alpha, a few of the things we're going to look at. So firstly, engage with OEMs to evaluate the technology. So really nailing down into the detail of how we integrate the electrolyzer with the heat network and also downstream off-takers in terms of transport as well. And that will be done to sort of highlight battery limits, as I mentioned earlier, at an early stage to understand where ownership and operation sort of starts and stops, but also to highlight any barriers there and needs to address any issues through design. Then there's essentially detailed design solution for the beta phase. So going through that design process in terms of mechanical and electrical engineering, continue engagement with hydrogen hub and heat network developers, which will be key for this because we need somewhere, a location where this is deployable. So taking that criteria into account and then identifying priority and secondary sites for the hub with a proposed layout then on the back of Alpha. And really key to Alpha, which we've been looking at recently, is actually getting to the point where you've got a commercial model and contractual framework between all the parties. We're dealing with heat network developers here, we're dealing with transport off-takers, gas network, electricity network. It's going to be quite complex. So making sure you're in a position at the end of Alpha phase where you're ready to put pen to paper is going to be really critical. So I think that will be challenging, but I also think it will be hopefully successful in the sense of preparing us for beta later down the line. And obviously then they're selecting preferred funding route in terms of their zero hydrogen fund business model, depending on the outputs of those earlier stages within beta. So Alpha, sorry. And then beta then will clearly go into the next phase of that, as we're aware, which later down the line, some of the items which are listed there. And really the benefit of this, which we all know through SIF, is the long-term rollout. So how can this be applied across the national scale, across the gas networks and electricity networks, and really give benefit to consumers through lower costs. Next slide, please. And this is just a bit of an overview of some of the work packages which we brought together as part of Alpha. So the work that's been identified to date that needs to be done. So obviously not going to go through this one by one, but just to give you a flavour of the work that will be undertaken. Next slide, please. That's us done. So happy to answer any questions and hopefully you find that useful.
Thanks both. Well, I think with this one particularly, what's really interesting is it starts to get to the nub of these multi-system interactions and really starting to tackle some of the difficult whole system problems that we might be experiencing through the energy transition. I would like to flag quickly to anyone attending that we've got ideation workshops for round 3 challenges, which are looking to bring consortia together to put proposals in. And one of those is on multi-energy systems, which is looking at cross-vector and different levels of the energy system operating together, which is obviously very applicable for this one. One of my colleagues will be popping a link in for anyone to express an interest in joining those workshops. We do have a few questions for this one before we move on to the next one. I've got one of my own, if I could start, in fact. So what exactly is the extent of the role in the gas networks for this? Could you give us an idea of sort of the distances that you might be using pipelines to transport over these? Are we talking quite a confined area? Just give us an idea of the scale of that.
Yeah, so I suppose that will depend on where we look to deploy the system. So there may be a need for a very short piece of network connecting electrolyzer to refueling station, or it may be something which is much longer. There may be a need to send a couple of kilometers down the road. I think that will come off the back of Alpha when we start looking at those particular locations. What we want to do in the first phase, I suppose, is just make sure that the concept stands up on its own. And actually, one of the things which I think is highlighted in your question, Dave, is that taking those additional potential costs as well of network infrastructure downstream of the hydrogen production could be really critical to this, and could mean that it's actually an additional selection criteria for locations that we need to factor in, because there will be a natural trade-off there between where you connect to the electricity network, or how you connect to the electricity network, and then also how close that point is to the point of hydrogen demand, and also the magnitude of heat utilization that you can draw upon. Because if there's high heat utilization, that might be a bigger draw to locate your electrolyzer next to a housing estate, or perhaps in an industrial unit, in which case the commercial trade-off then may mean that you need to run a larger piece of gas network downstream. So I think it is a wishy-washy answer, but in short, it'll come out in Alpha and will depend on the location. Yeah,
I guess some of those locational requirements will be quite interesting, because presumably the hub itself with 3 megawatt electrolyzer is a reasonably substantial bit of kit, and in some cases for district heating, you're likely to be looking at dense urban environments and things like that, where you might not have a lot of free land going around.
Absolutely. I think the key will be to tie in with those, identify an area where district heat is in planning, and looking to engage hopefully with a district heat provider for alpha. I think that's absolutely key for this project. But there'll be like I said, there'll be a trade-off there between how close you are to a district heat network, and also then being able to reach transport demand, because that may be, you could have a dense urban area which is suburban to a city, say Bristol, but actually there's limited access there for vehicles to refuel. So it might be there's a slightly disconnected system whereby the refueler is located, near a main junction, which is outside of the domestic housing estate, for the purposes of making it economically viable.
Into the gas network. So I've got a couple of questions here. The first one from Andrew Benfield. I think this one's for me, actually. Aside from today, what other dissemination activities are planned for these activities? There would be a lot of interest in the hydrogen hub project from policymakers and operators in Northern Ireland. Yeah, so we do have engagement mechanisms with policymakers and regulators who often act as sponsors of the projects, but we do internal briefings and seminars for Ofgem and DESNZ and other government departments. Take the point on Northern Ireland. It has been one that's been made before, and something which we probably need to move closer to front of mind. So we'll take that one away and look at how we can do some engagement with our Northern Irish friends as well. One from Andrew Stevenson. What is the hydrogen pressure that you plan to store the hydrogen at, and will it be a buried store using pipelines?
I'll pass it to Tushar in terms of the outlet pressure, and then I'll maybe jump on the back in terms of how we store it and whether it's underground or above ground.
Yeah, no, thanks, Henry. So I think the hydrogen pressure really depends on the operating pressure of the electrolyzer. And again, that's dependent on the technology that's selected. Typically, for example, alkaline or other systems, we were looking at around 20 to 30 bar gauge on operating pressure. And yeah, Henry, I'll pass it back to you for just the storage element.
Yeah, great. And I mean, if it 20 to 30 bar gauge, that's not unfamiliar pressures for a gas network to be dealing with. So whether that is some sort of looped underground network for storage where you're utilizing almost line pack sort of methodology, or whether there's an above ground storage vessel, then that's open for consideration. I think the way in which these sites are going is that you have MCPs on site which are reliable and proven forms of storage. So depending, and that for 3 megawatts may be unviable. So you may need to look at something like a composite vessel, perhaps something new like that, or maybe traditional steel storage vessels above ground. But as I mentioned, coma will play into that significantly. So trying to avoid that coma regulation of that 5 ton limit before you reach into lower tier will be key, particularly as this system will be inherently located near to dense areas of population. So it's it's not conducive to breaching into that. We want to avoid it as much as possible.